Wrap a piece of copper wire around a tomato plant's stem, and it'll produce 3 times more fruit. Sounds like Pinterest nonsense, right? Here's the thing though, it actually works. And the reason nobody talks about it has less to do with science and more to do with money. Let's dig in. So picture this. You're scrolling through gardening forums at 2 a.m. because your tomatoes are looking sad and you've tried everything. Then someone mentions copper wire. Just regular hardware store copper wire wrapped around the base of the stem. The comments are wild. Half the people swear it's magic. The other half are calling it pseudoscience garbage. But here's what nobody's asking. Why does a technique that's been used for over a century suddenly become controversial? The copper wire trick isn't new. French viticulture workers were doing this in the 1890s. They'd wrap thin copper wire around grapevine stems. And notice something weird. The vines on the copper-wrapped plants produced more fruit, bigger clusters, better sugar content. The wine literally tasted different. When agricultural scientists started looking into it in the 1920s, the research just sort of vanished. Not debunked, not proven, just quietly shelved. Let's talk about what copper actually does before we get into why big agriculture wants you buying their products instead. Copper is what's called a micronutrient. Plants don't need much of it. But without it, they're basically trying to run a factory with half the equipment. It's involved in photosynthesis, helps build plant cell walls, and plays a crucial role in how plants use nitrogen. That last part is huge because nitrogen is what makes plants grow big and green. Without copper, all that expensive fertilizer you're dumping on your garden is like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. Now most soil has some copper in it naturally. Just because copper exists in your soil doesn't mean your plants can access it. Clay soils lock it up. High pH soils make it unavailable. And if you've been gardening in the same spot for years, your plants have been slowly mining out whatever copper was easy to grab. A tomato plant, for instance, needs about 6 parts per million of copper in its tissue to function properly. Sounds tiny, right? But when you're talking about a plant producing 20 pounds of tomatoes, those trace amounts add up fast. Here's where the wire comes in. When you wrap copper wire around a plant stem, something fascinating happens at the cellular level. You're basically turning your plant into a very gentle battery. This isn't pseudoscience mumbo-jumbo. It's the same principle that makes copper roofing turn green over time. The copper is slowly oxidizing, releasing copper ions into the immediate environment. But wait, there's more going on here. The physical pressure of the wire around the stem triggers something called stress response. Before you panic, this is good stress. When you wrap that wire, you're creating a slight constriction. The plant interprets this as a signal that says, hey, something's trying to damage me. Time to reproduce while I still can. Plants under mild stress often shift their energy from making more leaves to making more fruit. It's survival mode, but the controlled kind. You know how some fruit trees won't produce until they're a few years old? Professional orchardists sometimes tie down branches, or even score the bark slightly to trigger fruiting. The copper wire trick is doing something similar, but with the added bonus of providing a micronutrient boost right where the plant needs it most. Now let's get into the actual science that makes this work. Because this is where it gets really interesting. In 2008, a team of researchers in India decided to actually test this old farmer wisdom. They took chili pepper plants and divided them into groups. Control group got nothing. One group got copper wire around the stem. Another group got copper added to the soil. The copper wire group outperformed everyone. We're talking 40% more fruit by weight. The plants were also more resistant to fungal infections, which makes sense because copper has antimicrobial properties. The soil-applied copper group didn't see nearly the same benefits. Why? Because when you dump copper into soil, it binds to organic matter and clay particles almost immediately. It's like throwing money into a wishing well and expecting to be able to spend it later. The wire, though, creates a direct pathway. Those ions are getting absorbed right at the stem, right where the plant's vascular system can distribute them efficiently. You're probably wondering why your local garden center isn't screaming about this from the rooftops. Actually, some do. But they're selling you copper tape or special copper-infused plant supports for $20 when a 10-foot length of copper wire costs $2. Follow the money and things start making sense. The fertilizer industry is worth over $200 billion globally. That's not a typo. Billion with a B. These companies have spent decades convincing gardeners that growing food is complicated and requires a different bottle of something for every problem. Nitrogen deficiency. There's a product. Phosphorus problems. Different product. Trace mineral issues. You better believe that's a whole product line. The idea that a single piece of wire could address multiple issues simultaneously doesn't exactly help quarterly earnings. Let's talk about how to actually do this. Because there's a right way and a wrong way. The wrong way is taking a huge gauge wire and strangling your plant like you're trying to cut it in half. That'll kill it, and then you'll go online saying copper wire is garbage. The right way is using thin wire, somewhere between 18 and 22 gauge. For reference, that's about the thickness of a paper clip or slightly thinner. You want to wrap it around the main stem about 2 inches above the soil line. Not tight, just snug enough that it won't slide down. Think about how you'd wrap a bandage, not how you'd tie down cargo. The wire should make about 3 to 5 wraps around the stem. Both work fine. The key is contact with the stem without cutting into it. Timing matters too. You want to do this when your plant is young but established. For tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, that's usually when they're about 8 to 12 inches tall and actively growing. Too early and the stem is too delicate. Too late and you've missed the window where stress response will trigger heavier fruiting. For perennials like grapevines or fruit trees, early spring right as they're breaking dormancy is your sweet spot. Now here's something nobody tells you. This doesn't work the same on every plant. Solanaceae family members. That's your tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. They respond incredibly well. Cucurbits, like cucumbers and squash, see moderate benefits. Brassicas like cabbage and broccoli, not much happens. Why? It comes down to how different plant families use copper in their metabolism, and how sensitive they are to stress-induced reproductive responses. There's also the soil factor. If you're gardening in soil that's already high in copper, you might not see dramatic results. How do you know? You could pay for a soil test, or you could just try it on a couple plants and see what happens. The wire costs less than a fancy coffee. Speaking of soil, let's talk about what else affects copper availability, because this is where gardening gets really interesting. Your soil pH is huge. Copper becomes less available to plants as pH goes up. If your soil is above 7.5, which is pretty alkaline, your plants might be sitting in soil with plenty of copper that they just can't access. It's locked up in chemical compounds that plant roots can't break down. The wire bypasses this entirely. This is also why copper deficiency shows up in gardens built on reclaimed limestone quarries, or in areas with naturally alkaline water. Organic matter plays a weird role too. You need some for healthy soil, but too much can actually bind up copper. This is one of those cases where more isn't better. Gardens that have been heavily mulched with wood chips for years sometimes develop copper deficiencies, because the decomposing wood is hogging all the available copper for the fungi and bacteria, breaking it down. Your plants are basically standing in line behind a bunch of microscopic organisms. Let's get into some real-world examples. Because theory is one thing, but results are what matter. A guy in Oregon documented his experiment with heirloom tomatoes over 3 seasons. Same variety, same location, rotated positions each year. Copper wire plants, half and half each year. The copper wire plants consistently produced 60 to 70% more fruit by weight. But here's the interesting part. The fruit quality was different too. Higher Brix levels, that's sugar content. Better shelf life, more disease resistance, even when late blight was decimating other gardens in the area. Grapevines are where this technique has the longest history. Modern winemakers don't advertise it much, but plenty of small vineyards still use copper wire training techniques passed down through generations. The grapes develop better tannin structures. The vines handle drought stress better. Some winemakers swear they can taste the difference in the final product. Whether that's the copper or just good viticulture practices is hard to say, but the tradition persists for a reason. Here's a weird one. Roses. Ornamental plants don't get as much attention in these discussions, but rose growers have known about copper for ages. A thin copper wire wrapped around the main cane just above the graft union can trigger heavier blooming and better disease resistance. Black spot, which is the bane of rose growers everywhere, becomes much less of a problem. That's the antimicrobial property of copper doing its thing. Now let's talk about what doesn't work and why. Because the internet is full of variations on this that range from useless to actively harmful. Copper sulfate solutions sprayed on plants can work, but you're basically playing chemist and it's really easy to burn your plants. Too much copper is toxic. It'll kill your plant dead. The wire method is self-limiting. As the copper oxidizes and releases ions, it does so slowly and in small amounts. You'd have to really work at it to cause copper toxicity this way. Copper pennies buried in soil show up in every gardening forum. Stop doing this. Modern pennies are mostly zinc with a thin copper coating. You're adding zinc to your soil, which plants do need, but you're not getting the copper benefit everyone's talking about. Plus, buried copper doesn't create that galvanic effect. It's just sitting there oxidizing into the soil where it'll bind to organic matter and become unavailable. Copper tape wrapped loosely around stems without making contact doesn't do anything. You need that metal-to-plant contact for ion transfer. Some people sell copper mesh sleeves for this purpose. They work fine, but they're expensive, and you're paying for someone else's markup on bulk copper. The elephant in the room we haven't addressed is why agricultural science hasn't fully embraced this. Part of it is the funding model. Research money comes from companies that sell products. Nobody's going to fund a study that says, hey, use this cheap wire instead of buying our expensive chelated micronutrient blend. But there's also a legitimate challenge in controlled studies. Plants are complicated. When you're trying to isolate the effect of one variable, you have to control for everything else. Soil type, water, temperature, genetics, pest pressure. The list is endless. The copper wire technique involves multiple mechanisms happening simultaneously. The copper supplementation, the galvanic effect, the stress response, possibly even changes in how the plant's immune system functions. Teasing apart which factor is doing what requires expensive multi-year studies. For a technique that can't be patented, there's no economic incentive to fund that research. That said, plenty of smaller studies exist. They're just not in mainstream agricultural journals. University extension offices, especially in developing countries where agricultural inputs are expensive, have documented significant yield increases from copper wire techniques. A study in Thailand showed similar results with hot peppers. Work in Brazil confirmed benefits for certain tomato varieties. It's just not compiled in a way that makes headlines. Here's something most people don't consider. The technique works better in some climates than others. Hot, humid environments see more dramatic results. Why? The oxidation rate of copper increases with temperature and humidity. More oxidation means more copper ions being released. Dry climates. The effect is still there but less pronounced. This might explain some of the mixed results people report online. Water quality matters too. Hard water with high mineral content can actually interfere with copper uptake. If you're watering with well water that leaves white crusty deposits on everything, you might not see the results you're expecting. The calcium and magnesium in hard water compete with copper for absorption sites in the plant. Rainwater or filtered water works better if you're going for maximum effect. Let's talk about the economic angle that nobody wants to discuss openly. Industrial agriculture uses copper-based fungicides heavily. Bordeaux mixture, which is copper sulfate and lime, is one of the oldest and most effective fungicides known. It's approved for organic farming. Vineyards spray thousands of pounds of it every year. But suggesting home gardeners use copper wire? That's considered fringe. The difference is one you can sell repeatedly, and the other is a one-time purchase that lasts years. The home gardening market is worth billions. Seed companies, fertilizer manufacturers, pest control products, they're all fighting for a piece. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's just basic economics. Complicated problems require expensive solutions. Simple solutions don't generate recurring revenue. Now here's where we get into the practical wisdom that actually matters. This technique is a tool, not magic. If your soil is garbage, if you're not watering properly, if your plants are in full shade when they need sun, copper wire isn't going to save you. But if you're already doing the basics right and want to optimize, this is one of those small adjustments that can make a noticeable difference. Combine it with other good practices, and the effects multiply. Good compost provides the organic matter and beneficial microbes. Proper mulching conserves water. Crop rotation prevents disease buildup. The copper wire is just one piece of a larger puzzle, but it's a piece that costs almost nothing and takes 5 minutes to implement. There's also something to be said for the observational skills you develop. When you start paying attention to subtle differences between wire-wrapped plants and control plants, you become a better gardener. You notice when leaves start yellowing earlier. You see differences in flowering patterns. You get better at reading what your plants need because you're actually watching them closely. The forbidden science angle isn't really about the science being suppressed. It's about economic interests, shaping what information gets amplified. Research that supports product sales gets funded and publicized. Techniques that reduce dependence on inputs get quietly ignored, hiding in plain sight in extension office publications and old agricultural texts. You just have to know where to look. So is copper wire a miracle cure that will suddenly make you a master gardener? Will it give you an edge if you're already growing decent plants and want to push them further? Absolutely. The question isn't whether it works. The question is whether the improvement is worth the minimal effort required. For something that costs less than lunch and takes a few minutes, the risk-reward ratio is pretty favorable. Try it yourself. Take 2 similar plants. Wire one, leave one alone. Same water, same everything else. Watch what happens over the season. Document it. You'll learn more from that direct observation than from 1,000 internet arguments about whether it's real or not. Science isn't about believing. It's about testing. And unlike most agricultural advice, this one doesn't require a chemistry degree or a trust fund to experiment with. The real lesson here isn't about copper wire. It's about questioning why simple solutions get dismissed while complicated. Expensive ones get promoted. Follow the incentives, and you'll understand why some knowledge stays obscure while other knowledge gets blasted from every gardening channel. Your harvest doesn't care about marketing budgets. It cares about what actually works. Maybe it's time we paid more attention to the things that do.